Most nights, the sky behaves exactly as expected. But once in a while, something pauses where motion should continue. No sound, no explanation, just a silent presence hovering above the desert. This is not a story about answers. It's a story about watching. When the sky decides not to explain itself. Chapter 1. Where the sky begins listening. The desert does not announce itself. It opens slowly, almost reluctantly, as though revealing just enough to test whether attention will be sustained. Light stretches wide here, unobstructed, settling across sand and stone with a clarity that feels deliberate. Sound thins, distance expands. The world simplifies until only essentials remain. This is why the sky feels closer in places like this, not nearer in measure, but in presence. Above the desert, the atmosphere carries fewer interruptions. Nothing crowds the horizon. Nothing competes for notice. The sky is allowed to be vast without apology. Those who come here often remark on the stillness, but stillness is not emptiness. It is density of a different kind, and accumulation of subtle movement usually drowned out elsewhere. Air currents fold gently over heat-warmed ground. Stars emerge with uncommon sharpness. Even silence seems to have texture. Long before questions were formalized, people looked up from landscapes like this and sensed something beyond familiarity. Not fear, not belief. A recognition that the sky was not merely backdrop, but participant. Watching began as instinct. Hunters gauged weather by cloud behavior. Travelers read direction in stars. Night after night, attention returned upward not because mystery demanded it, but because survival and orientation depended on it. Over time, that attention deepened. Patterns were noticed, cycles tracked, deviations recorded in memory long before they were written down. The sky became a reference point, a steady presence against which change was measured, and yet it was never fully predictable. Every culture, no matter how grounded in observation, left space for the unexpected. A streak of light that did not behave as stars do. A glow that lingered too long. A movement that felt deliberate rather than accidental. These moments did not inspire immediate explanation. They inspired pause. The desert encourages this pause. It does not rush interpretation. It stretches time, allowing thought to settle before conclusions form. Here, the unknown does not feel intrusive. It feels proportional, one element within a much larger whole. This chapter begins there, not with mystery, but with posture, with the understanding that before anything can be examined, it must first be noticed. And noticing, when done carefully, requires a certain kind of quiet, not absence of sound, but absence of demand. The sky has always responded to this quiet. It offers what it will, when it will, without concern for expectation. Some nights pass without incident, others carry brief deviations, small, almost polite interruptions in the familiar order. Nothing insists on meaning, nothing asks to be believed. The desert holds these moments without commentary. It absorbs them into its long memory, indifferent to whether they are named or ignored. This is where the story truly begins, not with an event, but with attention, steady enough to receive one. Chapter 2. The habit of looking up. Attention, once learned, becomes habit. It returns of its own accord, drawn not by urgency, but by familiarity. The sky becomes something to check, like a pulse or a horizon line present. Even when it holds nothing new, those who develop this habit rarely notice when it forms. It emerges gradually, shaped by repetition. A glance upward while walking, a pause during twilight, a moment of stillness before sleep. Looking up becomes reflex. At first, it is casual, almost unconscious. The mind registers light, color, motion, then moves on. But over time, perception sharpens. The eye lingers longer. Patterns begin to register before thought intervenes. Stars are no longer points, but arrangements. Clouds are no longer shapes, but indicators. Movement is no longer background, but signal. This is not fascination. It is familiarity deepening into awareness. The sky rewards this habit subtly. Not with spectacle, but with nuance. The way air behaves differently at dusk. The way light bends near the horizon. the way motion feels altered at altitude. Most nights offer nothing unexpected, and that matters, because habit trains patience. It teaches the observer not to anticipate disruption, but to recognize it when it arrives. Without this grounding, deviation is easy to misread. Those who watch regularly learn the baseline first. They learn how aircraft move when nothing is wrong, how satellites traverse predictable paths, how stars rise, drift, and disappear with steady precision. Only against this backdrop does anomaly gain meaning. Without habit, the unusual feels overwhelming. With habit, it feels specific. A light that holds too long, a movement that shifts too cleanly, a pause that refuses explanation. These moments are not startling. They are arresting. They stop the mind not because they provoke fear, but because they interrupt expectation. The observer does not react outwardly. There is no rush to speak, no need to announce. The moment is simply held. Habit also teaches restraint. Those accustomed to looking up understand how easily perception can mislead. Fatigue alters judgment. Weather distorts scale. Distance plays tricks. Awareness of these limits tempers reaction. So when something resists easy explanation, it is not seized upon. It is set aside. Observed again if possible. Compared against memory. Tested quietly against known patterns. Often, this is enough. The moment resolves. The sky returns to familiarity. Attention relaxes, satisfied. But sometimes, it does not. Sometimes, the habit of looking up encounters something that refuses to settle. Something that lingers not in sight, but in consideration. These moments do not demand belief. They demand honesty. The habit of looking up, sustained over time, prepares the mind for this honesty. It builds tolerance for uncertainty. It teaches the observer how to remain present without rushing toward story. Because the sky does not reward impatience. It reveals itself gradually to those willing to keep looking, even when nothing happens. This chapter is about that willingness, the quiet discipline of attention, the steadiness of repeated observation, the understanding that most nights offer only familiarity, and that this familiarity is what makes deviation meaningful when it finally appears. Looking up is not an act of seeking mystery. It is an act of readiness, and readiness, once formed, changes everything that follows. Chapter 3. Naming the unnamed. There comes a point when scattered stories begin to press against one another. They overlap softly, at first echoes rather than collisions, until the weight of repetition becomes impossible to ignore. Across different voices and distant years, the same careful hesitations appear, the same pauses, the same reluctance to draw conclusions too quickly. It is in moments like this that humans reach for language. Naming has always been our way of studying the unknown. A word gives shape to what refuses, clarity. It creates a container, something the mind can hold without being overwhelmed. To name something is not to understand it, but it often feels like the first step toward balance. For a long time, the unusual moments in the sky existed without a shared name. Each account stood alone, easily dismissed as coincidence or misperception. A light seen once. A movement glimpsed briefly. Nothing solid enough to remain. Then a phrase entered the conversation. Unidentified flying object. At first, it was cautious, almost modest. It did not claim origin or intent. It simply acknowledged uncertainty. Something was observed, and it had not yet been identified. But language rarely stays neutral for long. As the phrase traveled, it accumulated associations. It was never meant to carry. Stories grew louder. Imaginations rushed ahead. Entertainment wrapped the word in spectacle, until the name itself became heavier than the observations behind it. To speak it aloud was to invite assumption. Those who worked closest to the sky learned this quickly. Pilots, engineers, analysts, people trained to measure and verify understood that the moment the term was used, attention shifted away from detail and toward belief. What had been seen mattered less than what people thought it meant. So many chose different words or chose silence. Reports were written carefully, and filed away. Conversations ended early. The sky continued its quiet deviations, but fewer people felt safe acknowledging them openly. A name meant to clarify had blurred the view instead, and yet the observations did not stop. They gathered patiently, waiting for language that could hold them without distortion, words that described without insisting, words that allowed uncertainty to exist without being dressed as fantasy. That shift arrived slowly. It began with a subtle change in posture rather than policy, a collective decision to step back from interpretation and return to description, to focus on what happened rather than what it might imply. A new phrase emerged: unidentified anomalous phenomena. It was longer, less dramatic, awkward even, and that awkwardness was intentional. The phrase did not invite imagination to sprint ahead. It asked it to slow down. An anomaly is not an answer. It is a deviation. Something that does not fit expected patterns. Something that invites examination rather than assumption. Something that may eventually be explained or may remain unresolved for some time. This language widened the frame. It acknowledged that not everything unusual appears as a discrete object, and not everything observed remains confined to the sky. Some phenomena move between air and sea, between atmosphere and space, crossing boundaries that human categories prefer to keep separate. The shift was quiet, but meaningful. By removing implication, the conversation softened. Attention returned to behavior, speed, trajectory, duration, interaction with environment. Reports became less about speculation and more about precision. What was observed, how it moved, what conditions were present. For the first time in many years, those trained to notice felt permission to speak plainly. A light maintained position against wind. A shape accelerated without visible propulsion. A signal appeared across multiple sensors, then vanished. No embellishment, no conclusion, just careful description. And something else changed as well. Institutions began to listen, not eagerly, not publicly at first, but seriously. Data replaced rumor. Patterns replaced anecdotes. Questions replaced dismissal. The tone shifted from ridicule to restraint, from certainty to honesty. This chapter is not about solving the mystery. It is about learning how to stand in front of it. There is strength in choosing language that admits limits, in acknowledging where understanding ends without rushing to fill the space. This posture does not weaken inquiry, it sharpens it. Consider how often certainty is mistaken for confidence. How quickly I know closes doors that I'm not sure might open. And consider what becomes possible when uncertainty is treated not as failure, but as information. I don't know yet. That single word changes the weight of the sentence. It allows patience to enter. It invites collaboration. It creates room for listening rather than argument. The sky has always favored this approach. It does not reveal itself through force. It offers clarity, gradually, often indirectly. Progress comes through attention sustained over time, not through demand. Careful naming aligns with that rhythm. By choosing words that describe without assuming, we allow the unknown to remain proportioned, neither inflated nor dismissed. Long enough to be studied, long enough to be understood on its own terms. As this language settled into use, conversations reopened. Pilots spoke without bracing for laughter. Analysts compared data without apology. Scientists approached anomalies not as embarrassments, but as invitations to refine understanding. The mystery did not shrink. It grew quieter, more focused, more honest. And in that quieter space, attention sharpened. Details once overlooked came forward. Behaviors once ignored were reconsidered. The sky, long treated as background, returned to the foreground of careful observation. This is how awakening begins, not with revelation, but with restraint. Not with answers, but with better questions. Naming the unnamed did not solve the mystery. It simply gave it room to breathe. And sometimes, that is the most important step of all. Chapter 4. The edge between wonder and discipline. Curiosity does not always surge forward. Sometimes it slows, not from disinterest, but from care. It learns when to pause, when to steady itself, when to resist the urge to rush ahead of what can be known. In that slowing, something else steps closer. Discipline. This is where the story lingers now at, the narrow edge where wonder and discipline learn to stand side by side. For a long time, looking at the sky carried a kind of openness. People speculated freely. They imagined without restraint. But as knowledge hardened into systems and methods, curiosity began to feel exposed. Questions without immediate answers were treated as inefficiencies, or worse, as distractions. The sky did not adjust itself to this expectation. It continued to behave as it always had, mostly predictable, occasionally divergent, quietly indifferent to human comfort with certainty. Those who spent their lives watching it closely understood this well. They were not dreamers. They were trained observers. Their attention had been shaped by responsibility, refined by repetition, sharpened by consequence. They worked in environments where precision mattered and imagination was carefully contained. And when something appeared that did not fit, it did not feel enchanting. It felt wrong, not frightening, disruptive. Like a note held just slightly out of tune in an otherwise flawless composition. Subtle but impossible to ignore. The first response was always self-scrutiny. Angle, speed, lighting, fatigue. These explanations were welcome. They restored balance. They allowed the mind to return to familiar ground. Often, they were enough. But sometimes, they were not. In those moments, attention did not scatter, it narrowed. Observation became deliberate. Systems were checked and rechecked. Instruments were consulted. Silence replaced speculation. That silence carried weight, not the weight of fear, but of responsibility. To say I don't know in a world built on precision is not easy. It invites scrutiny. It risks misunderstanding. It asks others to pause with you in uncertainty. So many chose to remain quiet, not because nothing had occurred, but because acknowledging deviation felt more dangerous than holding it alone. Over time, this restraint shaped perception itself. Anything unusual was filtered aggressively. Dismissal became instinctive. Comfort returned, but at a cost attention dulled. The kind of attention that stays present when resolution does not arrive. Yet, discipline, practiced honestly, does not erase curiosity. It sharpens it up. In every rigorous field, anomalies are not enemies. They are signals, indications that understanding may be incomplete, that assumptions may need adjustment. Progress has always emerged from these margins. Slowly, a different posture took shape, one that neither chased explanation nor turned away, one that allowed wonder and discipline to coexist without canceling one another. Observation returned to center. What was seen? How long did it last? Under what conditions? What systems agreed? The questions were unadorned, patient, grounded. Meaning was not imposed. Interpretation was withheld. Just attention. This balance felt delicate at first. It required trust not in answers, but in process. Trust that careful observation mattered even when it did not resolve itself immediately. Those who stood in this space often described a similar sensation, a heightened stillness, a sense of standing at the edge of something undefined, aware that stepping too quickly would collapse it. The sky, in these moments, felt closer, not physically, but emotionally. Less like scenery, more like a presence that responded to care with subtlety. Nothing dramatic followed. No revelation arrived. Instead, something quieter settled in. Humility. The recognition that knowledge has boundaries, that certainty is provisional, that curiosity, when disciplined, grows deeper rather than narrower. This edge between wonder and display reshaped the tone of inquiry. It softened defensiveness. It allowed questions to remain open without becoming threatening. And in that openness, something important occurred. People began listening to one another again. Reports were treated as observations, not claims. Experiences were examined rather than dismissed. Skepticism remained, but it no longer rushed to close doors. The sky did not change, but the way it was watched. This was not awakening yet. It was preparation. A steadying of attention. A learning of posture. To look without demanding, to question without assuming, to notice without embellishing. It required patience, and patience, once learned, alters everything that follows. Because when wonder and discipline walk together, The unknown is no longer something to fear or conquer. It becomes something to approach gently. Something to sit with. Something to understand slowly and on its own terms. Chapter 5. The moment the silence cracked. Silence can endure longer than anyone expects. It stretches across years, settles into habit, and begins to feel structural like part of the world itself. People adapt to it. They learn which questions drift too close to its edges and which subjects are safer left untouched. Over time, the absence of conversation becomes its own quiet agreement. But silence is never permanent. It weakens first in subtle ways. A sentence phrased with unusual care, a report released without explanation, only acknowledgement. A tone that shifts just enough to suggest hesitation where certainty once stood. And then, almost without warning, the silence fractures, not with revelation, not with spectacle, but with a sentence spoken calmly, deliberately, and without apology. We do not know. Those words changed the atmosphere. For the first time in many years, uncertainty was voiced publicly not as embarrassment, but as fact. Some observations, it was admitted, did not fit established explanations. Not yet. This admission did not arrive alone. It rested on years of quiet accumulation accounts that resisted resolution, data that refused compression into familiar categories, moments set aside simply because no one knew where to place them. Now, they were being brought forward. Carefully, the shift did not occur because curiosity suddenly grew louder. It occurred because ignoring the unknown had become less responsible than acknowledging it. Safety required attention. Security demanded honesty. Science insisted on accuracy. So, the conversation moved, slowly, into the open. Pilots who had once hesitated recognized their experiences reflected in official language. Analysts saw long-held questions mirrored in cautious reports. The tone remained measured, restrained, almost understated. That restraint mattered. There were no claims of answers. No dramatic gestures toward explanation, only a clear acknowledgement. Some observed phenomena seen in the sky, near the sea, sometimes transitioning between the to remind unidentified, anomalous. The word carried weight without urgency. For those who had listened quietly for years, this moment felt less like surprise and more like release. A pressure eased, just enough to breathe. For others, it felt unsettling. Dismissal, even when convenient, had offered a kind of certainty. To hear that some things resisted explanation disrupted familiar ground. The world felt momentarily less contained. Yet the tone guided the response. This was not an invitation to fear. It was an invitation to reconsider. There is a difference between being told there is nothing to see and being told there is something not yet understood. One closes attention. The other opens it. This chapter lives in that opening. Statements that followed focused on evidence, sensor data, corroborated sightings, patterns noted across independent systems. What could be verified was emphasized. What could not was left untouched. It was a deliberate unveiling. Even then, the unknown occupied only a narrow margin. Most reports resolved under scrutiny. Aircraft weather, optical effects, human technology behaving exactly as designed, but not all. And it was that remainder, the fraction that resisted, that held attention. Anomalies have always played a particular role in understanding. They are not failures of knowledge, but markers of its edge. They indicate where models thin, where assumptions need revision. History advances through such edges. The silence cracked, not because the mystery grew larger, but because our willingness to face it matured. Institutions that once avoided the topic began to address it with care. Hearings reframed the discussion around responsibility rather than ridicule. Data sharing increased, the weight of stigma eased. This did not produce agreement. Skepticism remained. Debate continued. Explanations were proposed, challenged, refined, but the conversation itself was no longer forbidden. That mattered more than answers ever could. Because when silence breaks, listening begins. For the first time in a long while, The sky was discussed not only in entertainment or whispers, but as part of lived reality, complex, incomplete, and deserving of attention. This moment did not resolve the story. It acknowledged it, and in doing so, it carried the narrative forward, from avoidance to engagement, from dismissal to curiosity, from quiet suppression to careful listening. The fracture in the silence did not widen overnight. It did not flood the world with clarity, but it let in something essential. Air, space, possibility. And once that space exists, once the unknown is allowed to stand without apology, the journey can continue. Because the most important step in any awakening is not knowing what lies ahead. It is choosing to look together without turning away. Chapter 6. Objects that would not behave at first. Everything appears ordinary. The sky follows its familiar patterns. Light drifts where it should. Distance remains vast and quiet. Below, life continues its routines, unaware that attention is sharpened somewhere above. Then something hesitates, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to feel misaligned. A pause where motion should carry on. A stillness where momentum should insist. A glide that ignores the invisible agreements we rely on without thinking. The mind resists this at once. It reaches for reassurance, angle, perspective, fatigue, reflection. These explanations arrive quickly, not as denial but as instinct. The brain favors coherence. It prefers when the world behaves as expected. Most of the time, that preference is satisfied, but sometimes it is not. Sometimes the object remains suspended when gravity should pull it down. Sometimes it accelerates without effort, shifting direction without the arc that speed demands. Sometimes it moves as though air and mass have momentarily released their hold. These moments do not announce themselves. They appear briefly, quietly, almost politely, as if testing the limits of notice. And just as quickly, they withdraw. What lingers afterward is not fear. It is focus. Those who witness such behavior do not react emotionally. Their response is inward and precise. Breathing steadies. Muscles still. Awareness narrows to a single point, because movement carries meaning. Light can deceive. Distance can distort. But motion reveals relationship, how something meets resistance, how it responds to environment, how it obeys or ignores constraint. And when motion breaks pattern, it demands attention. An object descends rapidly, then stops without recoil. An object moves against wind without drift. An object transitions between states without turbulence or trace. These are not interpretations. They are observations. And when similar observations recur, they gather weight not through repetition alone, but through consistency of behavior. Restraint remains essential. No label is applied. No origin imagined. What matters is not what the object is, but what it does. Afterward, long after the sky returns to its usual order, the moment replays quietly. Angles are reconsidered. Timing is reviewed. Memory is tested for fault. Often, none is found. This does not bring satisfaction. It brings humility, because it suggests that our understanding of motion, though sophisticated, may not be complete, that the rules we rely on describe most of reality, but not necessarily all of it. The sky offers no explanation in these moments. It does not repeat the event for clarity. It resumes its stillness, as if nothing occurred, but the stillness is not empty. It carries the imprint of deviation, a reminder that something passed through awareness without leaving permission or explanation behind. These moments are rare, and that rarity matters. If they were constant, they would dissolve into noise. If predictable, they would be absorbed into knowledge. Instead, they appear just often enough to resist dismissal. They do not disrupt the sky. They unsettle certainty. And certainty, once unsettled, never returns quite the same. The world continues. Aircraft fly. Stars rise and fall. Gravity remains dependable. Yet, beneath that reliability, a small adjustment settles into perception, a recognition that behavior outweighs belief, that the unknown does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as elegance, has smoothness, has control where none should exist. This realization unsettles only when resolution is demanded. When observation is allowed to remain observation, something calmer emerges. Respect, patience, proportion. These objects do not challenge reality. They challenge assumption. They do not declare significance. They demonstrate difference, and difference, when met carefully, expands understanding rather than threatens it. The sky has always taught in this way. It reveals itself slowly. It does not hurry its lessons. It allows comprehension to deepen only as attention sustains it. In noticing objects that refuse familiar behavior, we are not witnessing disruption. We are receiving invitation, an invitation to look more closely, to refine questions, to accept that not all motion has been fully mapped. And when that invitation is accepted quietly, without fear or fantasy, the story deepens. Not toward answers, toward awareness. Chapter 7. Patterns that refuse to scatter a single moment can be dismissed. It can be folded into coincidence, absorbed by explanation, or left to fade at the edges of memory. Human perception has always allowed room for error, and rightly so. Most irregularities dissolve when given time, but patterns behave differently. They do not vanish when ignored. They return. They echo. They arrange themselves across distance and years, insisting on recognition without ever announcing intent. At first, the similarities are easy to overlook. A brief pause here, an abrupt shift there, a movement recorded, then set aside. Each instance, taken alone, appears insignificant, but when placed alongside others, a quiet alignment begins to form. The same behaviors recur. The same limits are ignored. The same transitions appear to water, altitude to depth without the disturbances physics would predict. No turbulence. No fragmentation. No evidence of struggle with environment. Attention tightens. Not because meaning is assumed, but because repetition narrows the field of coincidence. Patterns do not ask to be believed. They ask to be examined. Those tasked with analysis approach them cautiously. Comparison replaces speculation. Timelines are constructed. Data points are layered, not to force a conclusion, but to reveal structure. And structure, when it appears, alters perception. What once seemed isolated now suggests continuity. What appeared random begins to imply constraint to limited set of behaviors, repeating across unrelated events. This is where patience proves essential. To rush interpretation would collapse the pattern into story. To ignore it would abandon responsibility. So analysts remain balanced at the edge, allowing correlation to speak without pushing it toward explanation. The results are understated but undeniable. Certain characteristics recur with enough frequency to demand attention. Sudden acceleration without visible propulsion. Sustained hovering independent of wind. Rapid directional changes without inertia. These are not extraordinary claims. They are repeated descriptions, and repetition, in careful inquiry, carries weight. Importantly, the pattern does not emerge from a single source. It spans sensor systems, eyewitness accounts, radar returns, infrared signatures, different tools, different contexts, similar behavior. This convergence matters because instruments do not share imagination. When independent systems align, the margin for error narrows. What remains may still be unexplained, but it is no longer unobserved. The sky, once again, refuses simplicity, yet the pattern does not suggest invasion or intent. It offers no message, no escalation, no narrative arc. It simply persists, appearing, behaving, disappearing, over and over, in measured intervals. This persistence changes the nature of the question. It is no longer did something happen, but what kind of behavior continues under these constraints? That is a quieter question, a more demanding one. It requires letting go of spectacle and focusing on consistency. It requires accepting that significance may lie not in origin, but in action. Patterns do not promise answers. They promise orientation. They show where to look and how carefully As more data is gathered, the pattern sharpens without clarifying. The outline grows firmer while the center remains unresolved. This tension clarity without conclusion, and it is here that understanding begins to shift. From searching for identity to studying behavior, from asking who to asking how, from narrative to analysis. The unknown becomes less a mystery to solve and more a phenomenon to respect. This is not the end of uncertainty. It is its refinement. When patterns refuse to scatter, they change the role of the observer. No longer a witness to isolated strangeness, but a participant in ongoing attention. The sky, patient as ever, continues its demonstrations, and those watching learn a difficult lesson. Meaning does not always arrive with explanation. Sometimes it arrives as consistency, and consistency, quietly sustained, reshapes the limits of what we think we know. Chapter 8. When the sky met the sea. Boundaries comfort us. They divide complexity into manageable parts. Are here. Water there, above and below, sky and sea. These separations shape how we understand movement, physics, and possibility. They help us predict behavior. But the world itself does not always respect the lines we draw. The first accounts were easy to dismiss. A descent observed too briefly, a radar contact lost at the surface, a flash where waves should have swallowed everything whole. Each report carried just enough ambiguity to allow explanation to step in and smooth the edges. Reflection, sensor error, misinterpretation. The ocean, after all, distorts perception as readily as the sky. And yet, the reports continued. They arrived from different coasts, different decades, different technologies, yet they described the same improbable sequence. An object would approach the surface at speed. There would be no deceleration, no spray, no plume. The boundary between air and water would accept it without resistance. Then, silence. No debris, no disturbance, no trace. The sea closed over the moment as though nothing had passed through it. This was not a single anomaly. It was a category. The implications unsettled, not because they suggested something extraordinary, but because they disrupted an assumption so basic it often went unexamined. That environment dictates behavior. Air resists differently than water. Density, pressure, friction, these forces govern motion. To move seamlessly between them without consequence is not merely unusual. It is instructive. Observers struggled first with language. To call such events crashes felt inaccurate. To call them entries implied intention. Words leaned too far, one way or the other. So description returned to center. An object entered the water without observable interaction. That was all. The absence of interaction mattered more than the act itself. When aircraft strike the ocean, the sea responds violently. Water erupts. Sound carries. Debris marks the point of contact. These events leave scars. These did not. Instead, the surface remained composed, disturbed only by the memory of observation. Instruments recorded continuity where disruption should have occurred. The sea, like the sky, appeared unbroken. Attention deepened. If such transitions were possible, then our understanding of medium-bound movement required expansion. The object, whatever its nature, did not behave as airbound or waterbound. It behaved as if the distinction itself were irrelevant. This realization shifted inquiry away from origin and toward capability. Away from what is it, and toward how does it interact with environment. The ocean became part of the story, not as backdrop, but as participant. Its vastness, its pressure, its opacity, all were suddenly relevant. The sea hides more than it reveals, and yet it remembers. Sonar returns echoed briefly, then vanished. Contacts appeared below the surface, moved at speed, then disappeared without trace. The depths offered no confirmation, only continuity of absence. Still, the pattern held. Objects that moved from sky to sea did not reemerge as debris. They did not announce themselves. They did not leave evidence of struggle. They passed through boundary as though boundary were suggestion rather than law. This unsettled inquiry in a specific way. Not emotionally, but structurally. It suggested that our categories aircraft, submersible, projectile might be insufficient. The phenomenon did not fit neatly into any one domain. It occupied the space between, and in that space, attention sharpened, not toward fear, not toward speculation, toward humility. Because when the sky meets the sea without disturbance, it reminds us that the world still contains behaviors we have not fully mapped, not hidden, not hostile, simply unexplained. The ocean closes again. The sky resumes its vastness. Boundaries reassert themselves, at least visually. But something has shifted. The line between above and below no longer feels absolute. It feels permeable. And once a boundary is recognized as permeable, inquiry must follow it carefully, patiently, and without assumption into the depths where certainty has always been thin. This chapter does not resolve that descent. It marks that it's beginning. Chapter 9, The Weight of Observation. Attention changes the observer. This is rarely acknowledged, yet it is unavoidable. To watch closely, for long enough, alters the internal balance between expectation and perception. The world does not shift dramatically, but its edges sharpen. Subtleties, once ignored, begin to press forward. Those who remain with the unknown for extended periods feel this change first. It begins as caution. Every assumption is questioned. Every conclusion is delayed. Observation slows, not from uncertainty, but from respect. The act of looking becomes deliberate, almost ceremonial, because what is seen now carries consequence. In fields where precision governs outcome, observation is never passive. It carries weight, professional, ethical, sometimes even personal. To report accurately is to accept responsibility for how information moves through systems larger than any single person. This weight settles gradually. A pilot does not speak lightly about deviations in the sky. An analyst does not record anomaly without hesitation. Each observation passes through internal filters shaped by experience, training, and accountability. Yet, when anomalies persist, restraint becomes more difficult than disclosure. Not because the unknown demands attention, but because integrity does. There is a quiet discipline in reporting only what can be supported, and an equally quiet courage in admitting where explanation ends. Those who operate in this space understand the cost of exaggeration and the cost of silence. Neither is acceptable, so observation becomes exacting. Timestamps, censor, correlations, environmental conditions, independent verification. The language grows spare, stripped of inference. What remains is behavior, record carefully enough to stand without defense. This process reshapes perception itself. The observer begins to trust the act of noticing more than the comfort of explanation. Ambiguity no longer feels like failure. It feels like accuracy. And accuracy, sustained, produces its own gravity. Over time, the unknown stops feeling distant, not closer in location, but closer in relevance. It is no longer an abstract question. It becomes part of the working environment, something to be accounted for, even if it cannot yet be defined. This proximity does not create fear. It creates vigilance. A heightened awareness that reality is broader than current models suggest, that understanding advances not through insistence, but through patience maintained under uncertainty. The weight of observation is cumulative. Each unresolved report adds pressure not toward conclusion, but toward refinement. Questions sharpen. Methods improve. Assumptions thin. This is how knowledge stretches, not in leaps, but in increments borne quietly by those willing to hold uncertainty without surrendering rigor. The sky does not acknowledge this effort. It offers no reassurance, no correction, no confirmation. It continues its patterns, its deviations, its silences. But something has changed, nonetheless. Those watching no longer expect immediate answers. They expect continuity of attention. They understand that meaning may arrive slowly, layered across time rather than revealed in a single moment. This patience is not passive. It is active endurance. To remain present with the unexplained, without filling the space with story or fear, requires steadiness. It demands trust in process over narrative, and that trust alters the relationship between observer and world. The unknown is no longer an interruption. It is a condition, one that asks, not for belief, but for honesty, not for conclusion, but for care. The weight of observation does not bend the sky. It reshapes the one who watches it. And in that reshaping, the inquiry deepens not toward certainty, but toward clarity of attention, which, in the end, may be the most reliable form of understanding we have. Chapter 10. Living with the Unresolved. Uncertainty does not always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it settles in quietly, threading itself through routine until it becomes part of the landscape. It does not demand attention. It waits, steady and patient, asking only to be acknowledged. Those who continue working beneath unanswered questions learn this quickly. Life does not pause for resolution. Systems must function. Skies must be monitored. Decisions must be made with incomplete information. And so, the unresolved is carried forward, not as anxiety, but as awareness. This awareness reshapes behavior in subtle ways. Observation becomes more attentive. Assumptions loosen their grip. Familiar explanations are held lightly, no longer mistaken for completeness. The unknown occupies a defined place, not center stage, but not hidden either. It exists alongside what is understood. This coexistence requires discipline. To live with the unresolved is to resist two temptations at once. The urge to explain too quickly, and the urge to dismiss too completely. Both offer relief. Neither offers truth, so balance becomes essential. Reports continue. Data accumulates. Patterns sharpen without yielding identity. The process remains methodical, unhurried. By expectation, what changes most is not knowledge, but posture. There is a growing comfort with provisional understanding, a recognition that some questions mature slowly, and that forcing closure can obscure more than it reveals. This posture does not weaken responsibility. It strengthens it, because decisions made under uncertainty demand greater care, not less. Safety protocols adapt. Monitoring improves. Communication clarifies. The unresolved is no longer ignored. It is integrated. Outside these systems, the broader world responds unevenly. Some lean toward speculation. Others cling to denial. The space between fills with noise. But those closest to observation remain steady. They do not rush to fill the silence. They know that silence, when respected, preserves accuracy. Living with the unresolved does not mean surrendering inquiry. It means allowing inquiry to proceed at its own pace, guided by evidence rather than urgency. This patience reshapes expectation. The hope is no longer for revelation, but for refinement. Not for answers that end questions, but for understanding that deepens them. The sky, as always, offers no commentary. It continues its cycles, its occasional deviations, its vast indifference to human need for closure. And yet, within that indifference, attention finds its rhythm. Watch, record, revisit. Over time, this rhythm becomes sustaining. The unresolved stops feeling heavy. It becomes a companion. A reminder that knowledge is not a finished structure, but a living process, one that expands at the edges first, long before it solidifies at the center. To live with the unresolved is to accept that not all truths arrive fully formed. Some arrive as outlines, others as behaviors without names, and some arrive only as permission to keep looking. This chapter does not close the story. It steadies because endurance, not certainty, carries inquiry forward, and in that endurance, the unknown remains not as threat, but as invitation, quietly shaping the way forward. Chapter 11. The Quiet Reorientation. Change does not always announce itself. More often, it arrives as a subtle adjustment, an angle corrected, a stance widened, a habit gently released. The world looks much the same afterward, yet something essential is shifted beneath the surface. This is how reorientation begins. Those who have lived alongside the unresolved for long enough notice it first in themselves. The need for definitive answers loosens. Certainty, once prized as stability, reveals its fragility. In its place grows a steadier commitment to accuracy, to patience, to openness, without surrender. The unknown no longer sits opposite understanding. It sits beside it. This proximity alters perspective. Questions are framed differently now, not as challenges to be defeated, but as contours to be traced. Inquiry becomes less confrontational, more attentive. What is present? What repeats? What changes under observation? The sky responds as it always has. It offers variation without explanation, consistency without commentary. Its vastness remains unchanged, yet the way it is regarded has softened. Less demand, more listening. This shift spreads quietly. Across institutions, conversations adjust their tone. Across disciplines, boundaries thin. Analysts consult those outside their immediate fields. Oceanographers speak with atmospheric scientists. Engineers listen to biologists. The phenomenon does not belong to any single domain, so understanding cannot either. This widening does not dilute rigor. It strengthens it. Complex behavior requires layered attention. No single lens can hold it fully. Reorientation acknowledges this without frustration. The unknown, once framed as problem, becomes context, something that shapes inquiry rather than interrupts it. In this context, humility deepens, not as self-doubt, but as proportion, a recognition of scale of how much remains unseen, unmeasured, unarticulated. This humility is clarifying. It strips away the need for spectacle. It quiets the impulse to perform certainty. It leaves behind a steadier presence with what is actually observed. The sky, the sea, the instruments. They witness a soul are part of the same field now. Not separate elements to be reconciled, but interwoven aspects of a single, complex environment. Reorientation does not promise resolution. It promises alignment. Alignment between attention and reality, between language and limitation, between curiosity and care. Those who reach this stage rarely speak of discovery. They speak instead of responsibility, of holding questions well, of resisting distortion, even when ambiguity persists. There is a calm that settles here, not complacency. Clarity, the understanding that inquiry is not a march toward final answers, but a sustained relationship with the world as it is dynamic, layered, and occasionally resistant to explanation. This chapter marks no breakthrough. It marks readiness, a readiness to continue without urgency, to observe without forcing meaning, to remain open without dissolving into speculation. The reorientation is quiet, but it endures, and in that endurance, the story does not end. It deepens, preparing the ground for what may one day emerge not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, as understanding always has, through attention held steady over time. Chapter 12. Signals at dusk. The sun lowers without urgency. Its light thins across the horizon, drawing long bands of amber and blue that settle gently over land and water alike. At this hour, edges soften. Distances feel deceptive. The world pauses, suspended between clarity and shadow. This is when signals are easiest to miss, and when they matter most. Dusk alters perception. Instruments adjust. Eyes recalibrate. The familiar loosens its grip, just enough for deviation to slip through, unnoticed unless attention is already waiting for it. Those who watch during this hour know the feeling, a heightened stillness, a sense that the day has not ended, only changed its language. The sky reflects this transition. Air currents settle, light bends, reflections multiply. Everything becomes slightly harder to interpret, and yet, patterns continue. A point of light holds its position against fading wind. A return appears on radar, steady where clutter should dissolve. A signal lingers just long enough to be registered, then recedes into the growing dark. No drama follows, only notation, time logged, bearing recorded, conditions marked. Dusk does not reward impatience. It favors those who stay. The sea, too, enters its own quiet transformation. Surface motion slows. Thermal layers shift. Sonar behaves differently now, carrying echoes farther, then losing them without warning. Between sky and water, the boundary blurs. It is here, in this thinning light, that the most restrained observations often occur. Not because phenomena favor dusk, but because attention does. The world grows quiet enough to hear what daytime noise obscures. A signal transitions, a contact fades. A trace appears where none was expected. Nothing demands interpretation. Everything invites care. Those recording these moments feel the weight of timing, not urgency, but precision. Dusk does not offer repetition. It offers a narrow window, and then it closes. The sky darkens. Stars begin their slow emergence. Artificial lights rise to meet them, layering human presence onto the night. What was observed remains not as conclusion, but as record. Later, these moments will be revisited, compared, cross-referenced with others that occurred at similar hours, under similar conditions. Patterns may strengthen, or they may dissolve. Both outcomes are acceptable, because dusk teaches a particular lesson. Not everything reveals itself under full light. Some truths prefer transition, neither day nor night, neither certainty nor obscurity. The sky at dusk does not explain. It signals, and signals, by their nature, are incomplete. They indicate direction without providing destination. They suggest relevance without naming cause. This chapter lingers in that suggestion, in the soft narrowing of light, in the quiet competence of observation, in the understanding that meaning does not always arrive immediately or clearly. Sometimes it arrives as a signal fading into darkness, leaving behind only the knowledge that attention was warranted. And that is enough. For now. Chapter 13. The Long Watch. Some stories do not conclude. They settle. They find a steady rhythm and remain there, unfolding quietly without demanding resolution. This is one of those stories. It does not end with discovery or disappearance. It continues as attention sustained over time. The Long Watch begins without ceremony. No announcement marks its start. No moment signals that vigilance has replaced curiosity. It happens gradually, as observation becomes routine and patience becomes skill rather than effort. Those who keep this watch understand something others often miss. Looking is not the same as waiting. Waiting implies expectation. It leans toward outcome. The Long Watch does neither. It holds presence without insistence. It allows the world to move as it will, without pressure to perform. Night after night, instruments hum softly. Screens glow with restrained light. Eyes scan horizons already familiar. Most hours pass without incident. And that is the point. Consistency builds context. It establishes what normal truly looks like. Not in theory, but in lived repetition. Against this backdrop, even the smallest deviation becomes legible. A signal that hesitates. A movement that lingers. A transition that leaves no trace. These moments do not interrupt the watch. They are absorbed into it. Recorded carefully. Considered. Later, placed alongside others without urgency or embellishment. The watch does not react, it accumulates. This accumulation changes perception. Time stretches. Years compress. Individual moments lose dominance, replaced by patterns that only persistence can reveal. What once felt rare begins to feel contextual. What felt anomalous becomes part of a broader field of behavior. Not explained, but situated. The Long Watch does not assume intent. It does not assign motive. It does not reach beyond what observation can support. Its strength lies in restraint, because restraint preserves clarity. Those who maintain it learn to live comfortably beside uncertainty, not as a burden, but as a condition of honest inquiry. The unknown stops feeling like an absence and begins to feel like a presence defined. Even if its center remains open, the sky continues its vast routine. The sea holds its depth. The boundary between them remains permeable, if only briefly, if only occasionally. Nothing announces itself as important. Importance emerges slowly through return. This is the discipline the Long Watch teaches, that understanding is rarely sudden and never owed. It arrives, if it arrives at all, through sustained attention offered without demand. Most will never notice this process unfolding. They will see only headlines or fragments, moments torn from context and given shape too quickly. But the Long Watch persists beneath that noise. Quiet, methodical, unimpressed by speculation. It does not promise answers. It promises fidelity to what is shown, to what is not, and to the space between. And in that fidelity, something subtle endures. A relationship with the world that does not require mastery to be meaningful. A way of looking that does not collapse mystery into fear. A recognition that some truths unfold only when given time enough to do so. The long watch continues, not because something must happen, but because attention, once learned, does not turn away. Night completes its arrival without ceremony. Stars settle into their long-held places. The horizon releases its final traces of color. Above, the sky resumes its vast, patient watch, unchanged in appearance, yet subtly altered by everything that has been noticed within it. Nothing has been solved here. No final explanation has been reached. No single truth has emerged to gather all questions into itself. And yet, something meaningful has occurred. Attention has been sustained. Across chapters, the unknown has been approached without urgency and without fear. It has been named carefully, observed honestly, and allowed to remain proportionate, neither inflated into spectacle nor compressed into denial. This restraint is not absence of progress, it is its foundation, because understanding does not always announce itself with clarity. Often, it begins as posture, a willingness to look again, a discipline to describe rather than assume, a patience that outlasts discomfort with uncertainty. The sky has responded to this posture in the only way it ever does, by continuing to be itself. Vast, complex, occasionally divergent, never obligated to explain. And that, perhaps, is the quiet truth beneath all of this. The mystery is not a flaw in our knowledge. It is a reminder of scale, of how much exists beyond immediate comprehension, and how careful we must be when translating observation into meaning. The desert knows this. The ocean knows this. The night sky has always known it. They do not hurry revelation. They reward endurance. To remain present with the unresolved is not to abandon inquiry, but to honor it. To accept that some questions unfold slowly, across years rather than moments, across many observers rather than one voice. This story does not end with answers. It ends with attention still awake, with watchers continuing their work beneath open skies, with instruments quietly recording, with language chosen carefully, so it does not outrun evidence. Somewhere above, something may move again briefly, precisely, without announcement, or it might not. Either way, the posture remains. Looking without demanding, questioning without assuming, listening without filling the silence. The unknown does not need to be conquered to be meaningful. Sometimes, it only needs to be witnessed steadily, honestly, and together. And beneath the open sky, that watching continues.